Hey everyone, I am Jeff St. Pierre, and this is episode 149 of the Adult Education Podcast. Today, I'm speaking with scientist and explorer Neil Shubin. Here we go. We're back. The first brand new conversation on the Adult Education Podcast in about 10 months or so. It feels good to be back in business. I am really excited to share this conversation with you. I really had a great time with it. You know, it's hard sometimes for me to wrap my head around the fact that there are still places on this planet that we haven't fully explored, like still places that remain nearly untouched by humans and still locations that we don't fully understand. Neil Shubin is a scientist whose work has taken him to the literal ends of the earth. He spends most of his time exploring barren areas of the Arctic and Antarctica. So what's he looking for? Well, there are plenty of different things that he's looking for, and he's found so much. Though Neil will tell you that he's failed way more than he's been successful. In his new book, Ends of the Earth, Journeys to the Polar Regions in Search of Life, the Cosmos, and Our Future, Shubin takes us primarily to Antarctica as he looks for ancient fossils and other wonders. By taking us along for the ride, he introduces the readers to a magical world that looks more like the surfaces of the moon and Mars than it does a place on our Earth. This is one of those books that I'm going to have to reread a few times to fully take in all of the information. Not because it's a hard read. It's really not. Shubin knows how to tell a great story, but there are so many layers to this story. Every couple of pages, I found my mind was getting blown away by something new that Neil and his teams had seen in Greenland or Antarctica, wherever they were. So let's let Neil tell you some of the stories himself. Please enjoy my conversation with Neil Shubin.
Good morning. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Neil. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks.
Good. I'm excited to talk to you, man. This book is it's fascinating, and it scratches so many itches that I have, I feel.
Oh, good. Glad to be a balm.
Yes. Well, at first, I want to talk. It just feels like a weird time. You know, I'm reading this book, and I keep reflecting on what's going on around us every day, and I'm like, I'm so grateful and thankful we have people like you that are following science and looking for things out there in this world to try to help us understand the world that we live in more. That I'm also feeling like we're living in a reality where I don't know how many people actually care about science anymore, you know?
Well, that's why I do the writing, right?
Yes.
That's why I'm out there doing it.
Well, I appreciate that. How are things where you are? Because I know you work, you're working with a school too. My wife is an educator, and I know there's just been a lot of stress in her world lately.
Yeah, I mean, there's been, it's been a lot of uncertainty, honestly, with, this past week with regard to federal funding of scientific research and education. There have been a number of initiatives that I think are put on hold or stopped, and people are very confused about how to go forward on that. Review panels for scientific grants are being paused for a period of time, which does affect the scientific workforce. There's just disruption. I mean, it's what it is, and it's a lot of uncertainty. And the things we're certain about look challenging, So, it's one of those times.
Has anything impacted you and your research in particular right now?
Not yet. The couple things will. The one is the reviewing the federal grant, pause on federal grant review panels does affect us because we have two grants that are currently under review, one for a junior scholar in science looking at lung regeneration, and that's on hold at NIH, National Institutes of Health, and another on biodiversity, and that's at the National Science Foundation. So yeah, both, we'll see. I don't know. It's hard to say. It's, again, confusion's the name of the game right now.
That's true. Well, I hope that your stuff is able to get going. I hope you're able to continue doing the work that you do, because I do think it's fascinating. I want to dive into the book. The book is called Ends of the Earth, Journeys to the Polar Regions in Search of Life, the Cosmos, and Our Future. I'll be honest, I haven't read the entire book, but I've read pieces of it. And I want to say I love that there's a place in this world called Disco Island. I know it's spelled differently, but I just have a very big mental picture of what Disco Island must look like.
Oh, it's a funky place. What can we say? Yeah, exactly. It's in West Greenland. Yeah, it's off of Greenland, actually. So but it's disco with a K, right? So.
Yes, yeah. Spelled differently, but as soon as I read that, I was like, oh man, could you imagine Disco Island and what that would be like? But it's fascinating how many places in this world, as much research, as much, travel as people have done, there are still regions and places that seem so foreign to us. And that's kind of amazing to me in a way.
Oh yeah. I mean, honestly, when you think of these regions, whether it's the Arctic or Greenland or whatever, and Antarctica, So much is unexplored, right? And it's just, we've only really looked at the tip of the iceberg for some of these places. Just to give you one image, think about this. The ice of Antarctica covers an area larger than the continental United States. Huge. Okay, so thousands of miles. And if you go to the middle of that ice cap, and which the Russians, the French, and the Americans have done, and drill into the ice 2.5 miles below the ice, or in the ice, it's a huge feat, scientific feat to do that core. Under that core, and when they get to 2.5 miles beneath the ice, they find lakes.
I know.
Lakes the size of the Great Lakes. And when they pull the water up, what do they see? They see living things in there. You know, they see microbes that have been separated from the surface for millions of years. So that, in a nutshell, is just how much we as a species have to discover about our own planet, right? And it's a lot of that is in these polar landscapes.
I think even the way you describe Antarctica, and you say there's ice that covers the same landmass that, you know, is the continental United States. I think the image that so many of us have of Antarctica is like, it's just an iceberg that has some penguins and people go and they travel there once in a while to do research. But when you describe it, like, I mean, it's a massive expanse, but because we don't see it with our own two eyes, we don't think of it that way. We see that little white spot on a map, like on the bottom of a map, and that's Antarctica to us. And that could just be a floating iceberg for all we know, but you guys are there and you see it and it's massive.
Yeah, and here's what it is. It's a continent. You know, when you're in school, we learn about the 7 continents.
Right.
You know, Antarctica is one of them. But there's land under the ice. So obviously there's lakes, but then there's land. And there are mountains that poke through the ice. Some of these mountains are 3 miles high. And so with 2 miles of ice, 3 miles of mountain, you might have a mountain that sticks through the ice, the top of that. And here's what gets crazy. If you look at the tops of some of these mountains where we've worked for a number of years, you find fossil fish, tropical fish and sharks at the top of these mountains, surrounded by ice in every direction. So that gives you a sense of how the world has changed so much and how dynamic Antarctica was. There wasn't always ice in Antarctica. There wasn't always ice in Greenland. It's relatively new. It's like, well, geologically, 3 million years. That's what we're new. You know, what can I say? But I mean, you know, ice has come and gone. And you think about it, these areas cover only about 8% of the surface of the Earth, but they have 80% of the fresh water.
Right.
And that's a huge bank, right, of water that's sitting there. So when the poles melt, what happens? Water goes into the oceans, it changes our lives. So we are dependent on what's going on in that little white patch that you see at the top of the bottom of the map. We're very dependent on them. And that's one of the things I wanted to get across with the book, is not only how amazing these landscapes are, but how important they are to us and how much we discover by being there and how much we learn about ourselves by working there, you know, that kind of stuff.
I think that was one of the first things that blew my mind is the elevation, the altitude of where you were in Antarctica. Because again, I think the mental image of folks that don't study it, that have not been there is, it's ice down there in the South Pole, but you're talking about being, like you said, 3 miles in the air. Like you're 3 miles, not in the air, but like you're 3 miles high. Yeah. And it's just things that have piled up. You're on top of mountains, but we don't, the outsider doesn't see that. And I think reading your book, I was like, holy crap, like, is that real?
Yeah, well, the South Pole sits at 10,000 feet. Right. That's crazy.
Which I had no idea.
You know, yeah, when, you know, that's, you know, and so when you work there, or you work in one of these tops of one of these mountains, say at 9,000 or 10,000 feet, you really feel it. I mean, it's cold. It is cold. It is dry. It is windy. These are some of the most extreme environments on the planet. And, you know, we have to lead expeditions to these places that go 4 to 6 weeks, living in nylon tents. I might have a team of 4 to 6 people working together. You know, it can be pretty tricky to, you know, just live there, let alone do the science, you know. And so that's kind of what I want to convey, that just not only do we discover wonderful things working there, but we have to do a lot of amazing stuff just to work there. Yeah. And it's been decades of people developing these techniques and these tools and these approaches that, you know, people like myself have been able to use.
Yeah, you don't just decide like on a whim, you know, you don't just throw a dart at a map and go, oh, we're going to Antarctica tomorrow. Like there's a process, there's a season you can't go. Like there are things that need to happen for you to get down there.
A lot has to go right for one to work very safely in these environments. You know, like a typical, like an Arctic season might take a year of preparation. And an Antarctic season might take 5 years of preparation. Wow. So these are things that, you know, we plan on. And I'll give you an example. So I worked in the Arctic this past July. We were up in Ellesmere Island, which is one of the northern islands of Canada.
Okay.
We're there to find, see that little plushie behind me?
Yes.
That's a fish with limbs.
Yes.
That's a plushie of a fish with limbs. We were there to find more of that kind of creature, right? So we went to new sites. It took me 5 years to get to the site. I mean, so we applied and we were ready to go in 2020. Well, you know what happened in 2020. That extended to 21. Then, there were helicopter failures, things like that. We had to put off the expedition for a number of years. We finally got back this year. Planned a 4-week expedition, but we only had 5 full working days because the weather was so bad. So that's just, you got to deal. You got to shuck and jive. You got to you can have the best laid plan in the world, but that plan, you got to rip it up as soon as you get on the ground, because the Arctic and its landscape, or the Antarctic and its landscape, they own the show. They control you. Now, we were very successful, but we only had 5 full working days. We had some half days in there, but I mean, we got hit by a big storm. It wiped out camp, all that crazy stuff. Yeah, I know. I mean, it's the saga, but that's part of working there, right? And you gotta, you have to learn how to adjust on the fly. Plan really well, but then learn to adjust on the fly. And the only way you can adjust on the fly is by planning really well, kind of knowing, the drill.
Yeah, I mean, you tell a story at the beginning of the book where you talk about going to Greenland to do some research, and the pilot just drops you off, and you're like, I forget how long you were going to be there, but 6 weeks or whatever it was.
6 weeks.
6 weeks. So he's just dropping you off and going, Godspeed, and taking off. So you're like, you just mentioned, like, you were there, you were somewhere else, and your camp got wiped out. Like, you're there for 6 weeks. Like, you have to figure it out. Like, that's it.
You got it. And there's something, it sounds kind of spooky and crazy. And the few times I did it, and still sometimes, I get those butterflies. When I started, I was a complete neophyte, right? I didn't know what I was doing. And I was with 3 veteran paleontologists who kind of knew the drill. And that helped me a lot. But when that plane or helicopter goes, they leave you with your food and say, I'll see you in 4 to 6 weeks. It's an amazing feeling. And I use amazing because there's a lot of different feelings in there. Feeling number 1 is there's a little bit of, butterflies,
Sure.
I mean, I'm on my own now. I'm maybe hundreds of miles from the nearest people, but there's also a feeling of awe that no more internet, you're removed from the rest of society. My main concerns now are the people I'm with, the science I'm there to do, staying safe, keeping everybody else safe as much as possible. Your world becomes very focused. I mean, you're not checking your email and doing Twitter and, reading the news and, arguing about politics or whatever it is. You're very focused on the day-to-day. Breakfast, work, dinner, sleep, repeat, I mean, and there's something very cleansing about that mentally. I gotta say, in this world of continual interruptions, having that ability to focus on work and other people and actually doing science. I'm there to discover. It's not a camping trip. I'm really there to find stuff. Like all the other, I mean, I'm one of many polar researchers in different fields, and they're all there doing the same sort of stuff. I mean, in trying to survive and do science, different kinds of science, of course. Your world becomes very focused, and there's something very, cleansing, therapeutic about it. I like one of the hardest things about coming home from one of these expeditions is just that, having the phone ringing and all the notifications and all those little red dots all over your phone. I mean, it's kind of hard to get used to all that stuff.
I always joke with my wife, obviously at a much lesser level than what you do, but like I prefer to just go into something. Like if we're planning a vacation, she's like, okay, where are we going to eat on Tuesday? What about, I'm like, let's just get there and figure it out. Like, that's kind of how I am. Obviously, again, much different situation than being dropped off in the Arctic and having to figure out how to survive. But like, I am that kind of person that's like, I don't want to plan. The more I plan, the more stressed out I get. Just put me there and let's figure it out as we go. Like I kind of understand like what you're getting at. Like I understand that mindset of like, you just have to be in it and then you can really focus on what you have to do at the task at hand.
In this age, it's a gift. And then it's also a gift to be able to focus on the science, right? Because you think about what we learn about our world by studying these places. You learn about yourself, first off, living there, because it's, you're doing stuff that, I never imagined I'd be doing. And I never really trained for it when I was a kid. I never really camped as a kid or anything. So I had to learn a lot about myself. You learn a lot about the history, our planet, how it works. You learn a lot about our future, what's happening with the ice and how that's going to impact our world. You learn a lot about the cosmos and because of meteorites and telescopes. I mean, it teaches us so much. And I guess when I was writing the book, that was the spirit of it, really. Like, these wonderful places, which are incredibly fragile, really tell us so much about ourselves, our species, our planet, the cosmos, our future, so really are very important. And I wanted to just put that front and center.
I was listening to another interview you did not too long ago, and something that stood out to me, kind of on the same subject. You were talking about how you failed for 6 years before you found the infamous fish that you found, and that kind of started a lot of these things for you. And you even said there was no guarantee that we would be right. Like, you had a hypothesis,
right,
but there was no guarantee. And I think that's the most fascinating aspect about science to me, is that people in your position, you're like, I think this could be real. And you spend all this time and you go and it might not be. Like, there is a possibility that it might
There's
not
no
be
guarantees.
real. And I think it's kind of like you're spending years of your life trying to find something. And thankfully for you, you found it and you've had some great success over the years. But like, I just think about all the folks that don't find it, right? And like, what does that situation must feel like to them?
Well, I mean, I'm not finding more than I'm finding, right? I'm more of a failure than I am a success. The thing is, I'm more remembered for my successes. I'm not really remembered for my failures. But the thing about failures is they're never, you know the saying, they're never really failures if you learn from them.
Yeah.
And working in these places, there's a steep learning curve, right? How to do the work, what to look for, how to manage the landscape. All these lessons we had to learn over a series of years. Our success could never have happened without those failures, And, the thing is just giving ourselves, the team, my colleagues, Ted Deschler and Ferris Jenkins, they're really close colleagues on that. We worked really closely together and, we'd support each other. It wasn't always easy. It's the hardest part of these expeditions is, you might go there for 4 to 6 weeks. And, you're going to spend a lot of time not finding stuff. And you're going to spend a lot of time maybe even stuck in your tent for 3 or 4 days in a row in bad weather. And somehow you have to keep your head in the game. Somehow you got to stay on it. You got to keep your eyes and mind together, and it takes a team to do that. It's not always easy. I can't always do that by myself. And I'm fortunate to have colleagues where we can support each other. But also you learn little tricks and tools that kind of keep your head in the game scientifically when you're a failure. And one of those is very basic. It's like, have great food. I kid you not. It sounds so frivolous, but to have a really great dinner or have some really good food or snacks that people like, when that's all you have, that's the only entertainment really, other than the books you bring, that's a big deal. And, so you learn these little tricks polar expeditions have been doing this stuff for centuries, and they find the same tricks, and food is one of them. Celebrating people is another.
That makes sense. I mean, you're in a moment where like literally everything you have is in your backpack. You have to find a way to enjoy the time. You have downtime, you're going to have downtime while you're there. You've got to find a way to enjoy it, So I bet that is hard because you are in an isolated space and you're with a handful of people. There has to be something that draws you together.
Oh yeah. And you learn how to deal in those spaces too and things like that. You learn all those little tools, but so much of the science that we do depends on these very human considerations.
Yeah.
Keeping your head in the game when it's hard, managing interpersonal conflict, which might happen. These little things, the science we do depends on that, and all that becomes much more to the fore when you're in really bad weather or really weather that's total drudgery, or you're not finding things and people feel frustrated. And, you're dealing with very human emotions, right? It's not just science in the laboratory with a white lab coat. It's real humanity. And you're dealing with, the sorts of stresses that people deal with in other walks of life, but also what polar explorers have dealt with for, several centuries. So, you take lessons from all that.
I think too, along that same line, I think about those like sci-fi movies where you have people traveling from planet to planet and, one person goes crazy in the spaceship and it creates havoc for everyone. Like, obviously that's a movie and that's exaggerated. But I mean, if you're 6 people near the, exact South Pole trying to find something and there's nobody else around you, if one person doesn't have their head in the game, that could be a game changer for all the rest of you, It
can be. And I'm very mindful of that. That's why food is very important. Somebody may be losing their head in the game, but if they have their favorite comfort food, for most Americans, it's mashed potatoes or pizza. We do it. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. But there are famous stories. So I love going through Antarctic history. There are stories of people losing it on scientific stations to the point where they have to be locked in the freezer for a week before a pickup. There have been stories of that back, about 100 years ago or 50 years ago. No, but people do there's a big literature on the times when people have kind of lost it on polar expeditions, particularly during the age of exploration, in ships that would be overwintering for several years. I mean, they're not there for just a few weeks like we are. They're there for, years.
It's almost like being on a space station, you're
really
kind of locked in.
Yeah, it really is. But, we're not there long enough for that to really set in, but there are very human things that happen and we have to manage that. And the science we do finding that little thing that's now a plushie behind me, that took a lot of that as much as it did the science and the geology and the geochemistry and all that sort of stuff.
So I want to talk about that again, because, you're talking about how you go to these extreme places on the planet and you're finding these fossils, you're finding these bones and images from millions of years ago. And I just, it's so fascinating to me. I know we had Pangea. I know the Earth has shifted over the history of this planet, but it's still so interesting to me at how much things have shifted, right? Like, you would think some of these animals, there's no way they could have survived in these settings, but here you are. And I just think it's so fascinating to think of all the things that are places where you would not imagine they are. And here you are, you're like, I'm on the South Pole on a 3-mile high mountain finding fossils of these creatures, and it's incredible.
Yeah, and it's because there's a couple of reasons for that. One is these continents have moved around. So what is up in Ellesmere Island, up 800 miles from the North Pole today, it was once closer to the equator 300 million years ago. So that, warmer environments in the rock. But the other is also climate has changed a lot. So most of the history of our planet is a history of no ice at the poles. So times of having ice at the poles is relatively rare relative to the times when everything's not covered by ice. So one of the things about being a human living in this age of the Earth is our species only knows a time period of ice at the poles. And ice has been at the poles during much of our evolutions as a species. So much of our history has been driven by, is related to having ice at the poles in one way or the other. And, much of our future depends on what's going to happen at those poles.
Absolutely.
Because that water that's up there, again, 8% of the surface area of the planet, but 80% of the fresh water of the Earth is locked at the poles and in ice. A lot can change if that ice starts entering our world further towards the equator, which it is as we speak. So the ice is melting. There's no doubt about that. We can measure that from satellites. You can measure that on the ground, and that ice definitely melting. So we know these polar regions change all the time, and we know they're changing really fast right now. And much of the history of our species and other species depend on these changes to the poles. But we'll see how we adapt to the ones that are going to be happening in the next century.
Yeah, you talk about that in the book. You were talking about the collapse of the ice that took place 120,000 years ago in Antarctica. A piece of that broke off, and you talk about what kind of impact that had on the planet at the time and how high the sea levels rose from that. And I know we're facing similar situations right now, and you always see these stories in the news about pieces of the ice shelf that are breaking off. And you've been there physically, you've seen a lot of these things. I mean, what are you seeing that maybe I don't get to witness through a news story that I read, on the internet?
Well, one of the things to think about is when we can look at the polar ice by making measurements from the ground. As I said, we can have robots that go into the ice. We can also use satellites that kind of monitor the ice regularly all day through clouds and so forth. They look at how much ice is there, and they can look at the mass of the ice and the volume of it and so forth. Well, when you do that, what you see is the ice is disappearing very rapidly from Greenland. So the center of Greenland is just a giant ice sheet. The ice loss there has gone from around 50 gigatons per year in the 1990s to about 280 gigatons per year now.
Oh my gosh.
So it's accelerating. That's an enormous amount of ice that's just disappearing, going to the ocean. About the same for different regions of Antarctica. So there's an enormous amount of changes that are happening to the ice itself. If we look at the temperatures of the Arctic, and that can, again, be monitored by satellites or ground stations or what have you. And there are different tools to do it and different tricks and problems, actually, to interpret it. But in general, the Arctic is heating about 4 to 6 times faster than the rest of the planet. And as that heats, what happens? The ice melts. As the ice melts, you have a brown or dark rock or ocean that's exposed, and that releases more heat. So you get sort of an amplification, if you will, of the change to the Arctic. So all that's changing very fast, and the glaciers in Antarctica, particularly those lying along the coast, can be monitored, and they are definitely shrinking. And as they shrink, they're like little dams that hold the ice from the rest of Antarctica from entering the ocean. So as they shrink, we run the risk of ever more ice entering the oceans. So, this is all real. This is all measured. This is not, opinion. This is fact that can be measured, and there are real numbers behind it. I think where the tricky part comes in is trying to predict what the future will be. How much ice will enter the water. How that that new fresh water entering the oceans will change our world. That is harder to predict. We have to rely on models for that. But the fact that we're dealing with massive changes right now is like uncontroversial.
You mentioned that the glaciers on the edge act as dams, and forgive me because I don't remember where in Antarctica this is, but you talked about, was it Vostok?
These are the West Antarctic glaciers that have been best studied. Yeah.
Okay.
So these are glaciers. There's a series of them. There's a series of like 4 or 5 glaciers that have been studied, and they're on West Antarctica, and they're sort of like a laboratory system that the British and American Antarctic surveys have been working on. They've been monitoring those glaciers for the last, say, decade or so, actually longer than that. And it's pretty clear what these glaciers do is they lie along the coast. And here's the trick. Most of the melting of the ice does not happen from the top down. It's still cold on top. The air is cold. Where most of the melting happens is along the coast, where the glaciers approach the coast and meet the sea. Where they meet the water of the sea, that water is warmer, and it gets warmer with every passing year. That warm water creeps under the glaciers and then melts them from below, and then that's where they collapse. And as these glaciers along the coast collapse, they're the ones holding back the rest of the ice from entering the ocean. So that's the idea, is that these are like dams, and we're like a finger in the dike, if you will.
Yeah.
And as the ocean heats, then that causes these glaciers to collapse in different ways. And so that's clearly happening right now. Those glaciers are getting smaller. Those glaciers are melting because of warmer ocean temperatures, which can be measured as well. So that's all uncontroversial. What we just don't know is how fast will they collapse, what will happen when they collapse, how much will enter in, that kind of thing. What will the future look like?
Yeah. I know I don't have you for a lot more time here, but I do think the idea of the lakes under the ice is fascinating. That's what I was trying to get. I forgive me if I'm saying it wrong. Vostok?
Vostok, yeah.
Vostok, okay. So you have the largest freshwater, or 6th largest freshwater body in the world by volume underneath the ice. You said in the book that it has several islands, and there's 400 other ice lakes in Antarctica. I guess my question is, I know that there's miles of ice on top of some of these lakes, but I mean, what's stopping that water from getting out at this point? Like, I mean, as things start to change there, is there the fear that water is just going to start finding its way out?
Yeah. So it turns out this is a very complicated ecosystem.
Sure.
So that lake in Vostok, I mean, you mentioned 400 other lakes, which I cite in the book.
Yeah.
Is true. And so some of these lakes are actually connected by little rivers or canals that lie under the lake. Some of them actually connect with the seawater. So some of these lakes are actually close to the ocean, on the coast, and they connect with the sea level. So what we don't know is how much water is being exchanged under the surface of the glaciers. Is the massive lake under Vostok, is that communicating, if you will, with other lakes nearby? How much do those other lakes communicate with still other lakes, which communicate with the oceans? We don't know how much communication is happening there. We do know some of the lakes underneath the glaciers by the coast actually do communicate, not well, but they do communicate with the seawater. The ones more towards the center, like you're mentioning with Vostok, they probably don't at all. And those creatures in there probably been separated from the rest of living creatures. That ecosystem has been separated probably for millions of years from the rest of the living world.
It's fascinating. All of it is just, I mean, everything you're saying is blowing my mind and making me want to become an Antarctic expert as well. It's one of those things I've always thought it would be amazing to go down there. I don't have any reason to go down there other than just pure curiosity, which I don't think would be enough to get me there. But I do. It's just one of those places in this world that I'm like, I feel like I need to see this with my own 2 eyes. Like I need to be there because it just sounds remarkable.
It'll change the way you see the world.
I bet.
I mean, there are certain places that do that. Grand Canyon, Africa, polar regions. They just get in your blood.
Yeah, my family and I, we just did our first vacation since like 2019, and we went to Hawaii a few months ago, and obviously very different. But again, like it's a place that, as someone who grew up on the East Coast of the United States, you just see it in movies and pictures, and you don't understand what this beauty and what this, we were going through some sort of like botanic reserve, and it's like this is what I've seen in Jurassic Park or what I've seen on TV. I didn't know this was real. Like, but here it is, like right in front of you. And I feel like that's what Antarctica or Greenland and in the Arctic must sort of feel like, where like you've seen it in magazines and all this for so long, but now you're there and you're studying it, and your footprints are there years after the last time you were there. And I just think these things are so fascinating to me.
They are, and it's a real privilege to do all this stuff.
Well, I love that you're doing it, Neil. The book is called Ends of the Earth, Journeys to the Polar Regions in Search of Life, the Cosmos, and Our Future. There's so much more we could talk about, but I'm running out of time with you. So is there a place that people can go if they want to find out more information about you, or if they want to follow along with your science and your journey?
Oh yeah, I'm posting all kinds of pictures about the Arctic and movies and things like that in Antarctica on social media accounts under Neil Shubin. So check me on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, and you name it. And you can get the book at all, your local bookseller or online or wherever.
Well, it's a fascinating book, Neil. I appreciate the work that you're doing. I hope you're able to continue doing it for a very long time. And thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Great to be here. Appreciate it.
Big thank you to Neil Shubin. His new book, Ends of the Earth, Journeys to the Polar Regions in Search of Life, the Cosmos, and Our Future is available now. You can find it wherever you get your books, and you can find Neil on social media. He's pretty active on there. And thank you to all of you for listening to the Adult Education Podcast today. I'm just so grateful that you take time out of your day to join me, even after all this time away. Trust me, I am going to have quite a few new episodes coming your way here soon. Until next week, though, be well.